Our next speaker is Manuela Fernández Pinto. Manuela is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the Center for Applied Ethics in the University of Los Andes, Colombia. Her latest research aims to understand epistemic and social consequences of commercially driven research today, particularly in clinical trials conducted by the pharmaceutical industry. Her research includes social epistemology, the science and values debate, the history and philosophy of economics, and feminist philosophy of science. Her most recent publications are in 2019, Scientific Ignorance, Probing the Limits of Scientific Research and Knowledge Production, that was published in Theoria, and Commercial Interests and the Erosion of Trust in Science, that's coming out in Philosophy of Science. So Manuela, take it away.
Thank you. So good morning, everybody from Colombia. It's around 10:30 here. Let me put my time here. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me today and for putting together such a wonderful group of panelists. I'm going to be talking about the social organization of science during the COVID pandemic, but before start talking about the COVID pandemic as such, I think it is important to understand how scientific research and biomedical research in particular has been funded for the last decades. So I'm going to start with that. So as you probably know, and as Sergio confirmed in his talk, the percentage of private funding for R&D research and development has steadily increased since at least the end of the Cold War. And in contrast, the total percentage of public funding of R&D has decreased, at least in the US and in the European Union, because China is another story here. I am not going to go into that. So that as of today, the private sector performs around 73% and funds 70% of R&D in the US. And talking about pharmaceuticals in particular, well, the pharmaceutical industry has become a paradigmatic case of of commercialized and privatized R&D in worldwide. So here's a figure from the National Science Board, the Science and Engineering Indicators of 2018, where we can clearly see how the funding of scientific research basically shifted around the 80s. And it is now the case that R&D is vastly funded by the private industry. So in addition to this privatization and commercialization of research, in the last decades, we've seen also like this going on global scale. So it is not only that it's being nationally privatized, but it's also like big multinational companies that conduct scientific research worldwide. For some, at the beginning, this sounds like a very positive scenario because for some, it was thought that globalization would mean that researchers, especially in the global south, were going to have access to information and knowledge, resources that they didn't have before. And this was seen as a more democratic and horizontal endeavor. But in fact, it has not been the case. The global R&D has brought gross inequalities in the international division of research and development. The majority of the funding for scientific research comes from the global north. And this means, among other things, that the global north sets the research agendas of the different research programs. And the funding is spread through to the global south in the form of different mechanisms like grants, charity foundations, international collaborations, etc. International collaborations and networks within scientific communities are also pretty hierarchical. Normally, the partners in the global north are setting the agendas, the problems, the questions for research development, and they're also leading data interpretation and publication processes, while the hard work of data gathering and analysis is done in the global south. And talking about biomedical research in particular, research has centered around diseases that mostly affect the global north and that are in many cases only affordable in the global north, even when subjects are recruited in the global south. So it has been very common for pharmaceutical companies and these contract research organizations that Sergio was talking about to conduct scientific research phase 3 trials, for instance, in the Global South, as it is happening right now with the COVID vaccine efforts. But the vaccines or the different treatments that are developed are mainly targeting diseases that affect the Global North or are so expensive that they're just not affordable in the Global South. So another figure from the NSB to show you this. So as you can see here, I just want to highlight that the vast majority of expenditures of R&D come from the Global North. This doesn't mean that the money stays in the Global North. A lot of it does, but also a good chunk travels to the Global South to fund research efforts in the Global South with these vertical characteristics that I was talking about. Okay, so what has changed with the pandemic? And this is interesting. I think little has changed. Some things you see like slight changes. For instance, platforms such as Elsevier have made COVID research publicly available. So they consider that because we're in the state of a pandemic, it is important to make research free and easily available to all researchers around the world. So they just are not charging for COVID-related research. But this doesn't mean that they are changing any of their scheme for charging for the journals that they have under the platform. Is just a temporary change that they've made. We've also seen huge efforts to produce vaccines, around 100, at least 100 efforts to produce vaccines, and these vary widely. So this is a very mixed group. You have here efforts from national foundations, like national science foundations around the world, a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, for instance, also in Africa and South America, that have national efforts to produce vaccines. And you also have, for instance, a lot of small universities in the Global South that have efforts to produce vaccines. But the truth is that what are looking like the most promising cases, the top 10, that is those that are currently on phase 3 trials, are all driven by big pharmaceutical companies or in collaboration with pharmaceutical companies. So that has not changed a lot either. We've seen some cuts on non-COVID biomedical research worldwide, as expected, especially charitable funded agencies, which of course affect funding for research in the Global South especially. And we have seen these huge national efforts to increase funding for COVID research. So you probably know that the NIH allocated $3.6 billion for COVID research, and the European Union, through its program Horizon 2020, is allocating 1.6 billion euros for the same goal. So who benefits from pandemic science? I'm going to claim that the pandemic science is still a commercially driven endeavor. We've seen a lot of these public-private collaborations being encouraged. For instance, the Moderna and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the US, which is a branch of the NIH, or the Oxford AstraZeneca. This is another big one. And we've also seen, this is also interesting, the Pfizer BioNTech collaboration. This is not a private public, but a private collaboration. But it's also interesting because I think it's a very clear example of this globalized privatization of science. So you have a very small biotech company, a startup basically, that is collaborating with this giant pharmaceutical company, and is probably going to be absorbed by the pharmaceutical. So it wouldn't surprise me if BioNTech is bought by Pfizer eventually. And this is also a model of how pharmaceutical research works today. So it's not only through these contract research organizations that Sergio was talking about, but also these small startup biotech companies that are, most of them a failure, so most of them go bankrupt, but there are some of them like BioNTech, which succeed, and then they are bought by these big pharmaceutical companies, but all the risk, the financial risk is absorbed by these small startups. So that's another collaboration that is interesting in pandemic science today. Pharmaceutical companies are able to receive federal funding from taxpayers' money. So from these grants from the NIH or Horizon 2020 programs, they're able to receive funding from that or directly from governments as well, earmarked funds. And so it doesn't surprise me that pharmaceutical companies have significantly increased their lobbying expenditures during the pandemic. So you probably know that in the US, lobbying Congress is legal and is very common. So pharmaceutical companies pay people, lobbyists, to go to Washington and talk to congressmen and congresswomen so that they can talk them into approving legislation that is favorable to them. And this is money that is seen as very well spent by the pharmaceutical companies because it's very successful. They actually get very good results from this practice. And so it is no surprise that they have importantly increased their lobbying expenditure during the pandemic. And so to get favorable legislator. And so despite the source of funding, it doesn't matter if the pharmaceutical companies are taking money from the governments or from charity foundations, or it doesn't matter. The profits will be private, and this is important. So the pharmaceutical companies can fund the research through their own capital. They can buy these or collaborate with these small biotech companies, startups. They can collaborate with universities. They can receive government grants. At the end, they set the price for the product and they profit privately. So let me say one thing more about these sources of funding and profits, because I think during the pandemic, we've seen some interesting examples of this. So Pfizer, for instance, decided not to receive funding from the US government from this big US operation called Warp Speed. But BioNTech did receive more than 300 million euros from the German government directly to fund the research. Other examples are, for instance, Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, who have decided that they're going to sell the vaccine when it becomes eventually available for a non-for-profit price. So it's going to be presumably very cheap, like $5 or something like that. And another example is Moderna, which has received a lot of money from the US government, so around $1 billion from the US government. And it has priced its vaccine starting at $32. So this is a company that has received a lot of taxpayers' money and is still going to ask for a higher price for the vaccine. So it's going to profit from the vaccine. So you have a mix of prices and decisions from the pharmaceutical companies about whether to profit or not from the research, or how much, let's say, how much profit from the research results. But it's important here is that these are all decisions from the pharmaceutical companies. So they are the ones who decide if what the price is and how much are they going to profit from the results of the research. Okay, so to start answering some of the big questions that were posed for the panel, I think in order to think about how are we to fund pandemic science, we have to start by knowing how it has been funded. And it has been funded following the social and commercial organization of science that was already in place before the pandemic. So I haven't seen at least any huge efforts to change the structure of funding of science during the pandemic. You also asked if it is best to leave these efforts to each country or can equalized standards be set? And for this question, I think that the global privatization of science has been successfully exploited during the pandemic. So the structure, these globalized structures where you have all these centers around the world and the big pharmaceutical companies bringing money from the global north can spread the research efforts to the global south has been taken advantage of during the pandemic. So the Pfizer vaccines, for instance, we're seeing it. We've seen the phase 3 trials in places like South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, and others. And so they're just taking advantage of this globalized framework. And how can inequalities be managed? Well, the current organization of R&D, I think, thrives in inequality, especially because of this. So they just take advantage of the centers that they have in the global south, especially if they have weaker regulatory environments. If many of them, it is easier to recruit subjects for clinical trials. And so in order to manage the inequalities in the pandemic science, I think we have to start thinking about how to handle inequalities in global R&D more generally. So just to conclude, because I think I'm running out of time, I think pandemic science is developing in a commercially driven research environment, the one that was already set before the pandemic started. It has just followed the same channels that were already in place, and is taking advantage of the global networks that were already in place, with, I think, in turn, exploit social inequalities that exist in our world today. So to start thinking about how socially how to fund pandemic science in a socially responsible way, I think we have to start thinking about how to what are better structures for the funding of science, R&D more generally, not just pandemic science, because pandemic science has just followed the same channels that were already in place. Thank you.